I'm Milan Shrevinsky and you're watching TVP World Talks, where every word matters. In the Kursk region, Russia has suffered a humiliating defeat. Of course, it is not conclusive, but what we do know is that Russia has lost plenty of troops, some of them taken into custody by the Ukrainian forces, and also 3 bridges either destroyed or damaged. For the time being, the incursion into Kursk has been a resounding success for Ukraine. But what about the ultimate objectives, and can this success be sustained? Well, in order to answer these questions and more, we have invited Taras Kuzio, professor of political science at the National University of the Kyiv Mohyla Academy. Hello and welcome to TVP World.
Good morning. Thank you for inviting me.
So, how long-lasting do you think is this success? Will Ukraine be able to hold on to these positions? And also a related question, for how long does it need to do it? Because we know it's all about a buffer zone right now. For how long would they need to sustain this for this buffer zone to be effective?
I doubt very much even President Zelensky knows the answer to that question, because a buffer zone, by the nature of what it is, would require it to be there for the entirety of the war. The whole purpose of a buffer zone is for this sort of northeastern part of Ukraine, Kharkiv and Sumy regions, so that the Russian artillery is pushed away from the Ukrainian border and it cannot, they're out of range of being able to hit Ukrainian settlements, villages, small towns along the border. So that will continue. Zelensky and Ukrainian officials have also talked about the idea of exchanging maybe territory. I'm a bit more pessimistic. I don't think that Vladimir Putin would want to show himself to be weak by agreeing to some sort of exchange of territory. You know, this region of Kursk in exchange for, say, somewhere in the southeast of Ukraine, which is occupied by Russia since 2022. I think the final potential reason why it could stay longer is that President Zelensky would like to maybe use this as a kind of a pressure point in future negotiations. But again, I'm not so hopeful about this, because this would again, if Vladimir Putin agreed to something like this, it would again show him to be quite weak. And he's a dictator in a totalitarian system. You cannot be seen to be weak if you're a dictator, because then you're very likely to be overthrown. So he has to continue to show this kind of machismo strongman approach, and negotiating from a position of weakness with Zelensky would be something I doubt he would do. But so we shall see. But I think probably the most successful component is what you've already stated, and that is it would act as a buffer zone and a morale booster for Ukrainians after the failure of last year's counteroffensive, and also have a tremendous impact on sowing dissent and divisions inside Russia, particularly between the population and Putin, and also amongst Russian elites, because this, of course, is very embarrassing.
It certainly is. Even Russian propagandists have actually acknowledged the fact that things are not really going well on the front lines. Now, let me ask you one question.
Well, they
because,
did, after all, say that they were going
yes.
to conquer Kiev and Ukraine in 3 days. So
yes.
It's gone from conquering Ukraine in 3 days to Ukraine conquering Russia in 3 days. Kursk.
It would appear so. I mean, some people were saying exactly that. You've mentioned the general principle that dictators will not negotiate from a position of weakness. Doesn't this imply that Russia will always have to do something that will amount to escalation in our eyes in order to be in a position of strength, though? Because it is a dangerous phenomenon, because if we assume exactly that, it would mean that, well, we cannot really push Russia into a position of weakness, because then it will not negotiate. But if it's in a position of strength, it will not negotiate either, because it feels like, it will feel like it doesn't really have a need to do that. So what do you think is going to be the exit from this conundrum?
It's very difficult to know this, because this war will continue as long as Vladimir Putin is Russia's ruler. He cannot really escape from this war. This war is all about him. Since about 2012, when he returned to the presidency, President Putin sees himself as going into Russian history, history books, as somebody, as a great leader, following Joseph Stalin, Peter the Great, Catherine. His goal is the destruction of Ukrainian identity and destruction of the Ukrainian state. Those are his maximum goals, and they haven't changed. So it's difficult to see how you can negotiate with somebody like this, who not only has these maximum goals, but doesn't live in the real world. And what do I mean by that? Well, his policies in this war is leading to the destruction of Russia itself. Russia has de facto lost probably something like 3/4 of its military equipment since the war began. It's losing military equipment. Airfields are being bombed by Ukraine. Energy facilities are being destroyed by Ukraine on a daily basis. The more this goes on, the more Russia will go into decline. I mean, the joke was at the beginning of the war, Russia claimed it had the second best army in the world. Well, actually, it's got the second best army in Russia now. Ukraine's the best army. And so I think it's difficult to see how Putin can get out of this, because even if there was an agreement now where some Western leaders talk about some kind of territorial compromise where Russia would be allowed to control this 20% it currently occupies, that would never be enough for Putin. Putin wants to capture what he considers to be Russian cities like Kharkiv, Odessa, Kiev. And so his maximal goals are there, but he doesn't have the tools, the resources to achieve that. And we've seen this in everywhere. I mean, Ukraine has taken more territory in a few days than Russia has taken in an entire year in the Donbass.
Would you say that it has been one of the successes of this operation in the Kursk region that all this narrative in the West concerning territorial concessions has now abated? Nobody seems to talk about this anymore.
Well, it has, and these discussions anyway were abstract because they didn't take into account Ukrainian public opinion. Ukrainian public opinion, and I follow Ukrainian opinion polls regularly, show that they are opposed to some kind of territorial concession to Russia. And if President Zelensky agreed, and I don't think he would, if he agreed to something like this, he could be faced with a popular uprising like the Orange Revolution or the Euromaidan Revolution. Because too many Ukrainians have died, too many Ukrainians have suffered, both civilians and military. There's been too much bloodshed for some kind of compromise. And also, I just don't think this would be a way to end the war. It would be a temporary pause before the Kremlin would again try to capture other parts of Ukraine, such as Kharkiv and Kiev. So it's a kind of a false analogy, but I'm glad to see that this Kursk operation has reduced the number of people in the West who are calling for this. One final point on this. Many of those who are calling for some kind of territorial compromise in the West are actually Kremlin useful idiots. They are camouflaging their pro-Russian position by saying, no, we are for the end to the war, end to bloodshed, for peace. We don't want people to be killed. But in reality, they're saying, okay, let Russia have this 20% that's been occupied. Why are they not calling today upon Russia to agree to a compromise and peace by allowing Ukraine to occupy its territory in Kursk? It's only one way. It's only okay if Russia occupies. So there's a lot of kind of, I think, mixed messages. But Ukraine now has the initiative, not Russia. And I think many people believe that this will now continue, especially next year when Russia will be exhausted from this war. It's losing over 1,000 people a day, 1,000 soldiers a day. That cannot continue indefinitely.
Speaking of the public opinion in the West, recently a retired German general has written a piece for Die Welt, I think, in which he said, The operation in Kursk shows clearly that Russian red lines are pretty much worthless. They are fictitious. We should no longer abide by these red lines. Instead, we should provide Ukraine with all the weapons it needs. Had we done so, perhaps Ukraine wouldn't need to cross the border at all. It would have simply been able to destroy Russian targets as they are using long-range missiles. Do you think the West is going to change its calculus now?
The main country that had these sort of fears of red lines was actually the United States, the Biden administration. Germany, Chancellor Scholz kind of always hid behind President Biden. I'd be surprised if they did change their viewpoint. I think it's too late in the election game for President Biden, and we don't know who will be U.S. president next year, Kamala Harris or Donald Trump. So I'd be surprised if that would change. But you're right, of course, that Ukraine's incursion into Kursk, into Russia, has shown that these red lines are a fiction. This fear of escalation is a fiction because the idea that Russia would somehow use nuclear weapons to fight against the Ukrainian incursion is absurd. I mean, it would be nuking its own territory, Russian territory, if it tried that. So yes, it's been shown for them to be wrong, and historians will show that if the West, if the US in particular and Germany, who have bigger kind of stocks of military equipment, had given Ukraine everything they had back in late 2022 when Ukraine defeated Russia in Kharkiv, then this war would have been over now, because back in late 2022, Russia had not yet mobilized its hundreds of thousands of troops. It only had 170,000 in Ukraine at that time, and it had not built these fortifications in the southeast. The war would have been finished, but instead we have this long grinding war, and there is a kind of a suspicion on people like myself that think that for some countries it's better for the war to be never ending and for Ukrainians to die rather than for NATO member countries' soldiers to die.
Which countries would that be, in your opinion?
That's wrong. It's Ukrainians' interest for the war to end quickly, not for the war to continue indefinitely.
It should be in the interest of everyone, but which countries do you think would have preferred a never-ending war? Some have suggested that China, for example, doesn't have an interest in a strong Ukraine, it doesn't have an interest in a strong Russia. It would prefer for this to grind on indefinitely.
You're absolutely right that, ironically, China and the United States both have the same interest in this war not ending quickly, because both countries, China and the US, do not want to see a Russian defeat. This is ironic, for different reasons, of course. China does not want to see a Russian defeat because this would be an end to their goal of transforming the world from what they call a unipolar US-led world to a so-called multipolar world, where countries like Russia, China, Iran would have greater influence. The United States doesn't want Russia to be defeated because, and it's never said this publicly, it never said its goal is Russia's defeat, because it doesn't want kind of a chaotic, disintegrating, nuclear-powered Russia. So both countries are, in fact, supplying enough weapons to Russia on the part of China, to Ukraine on the part of the US, but not enough weapons for either Russia to win, to be victorious, or for Ukraine to win. So
maintaining this violent equilibrium of war, and unfortunately, it is the ordinary people that are paying the price for this. Unfortunately, we have reached the end of our conversation now.
And the cost as well.
Of course, certainly is. Professor Taras Kuzio was our guest today here on TVP World. Thank you very much for joining us and for sharing your expertise.
Thank you.
And I'm National University of Kyiv, watching TVP World. Please do stay with us.